Welcome. As many of you know, I'm Rabbi Sue Shankman. It gives me great pride to welcome you to the Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series. The Amram Scholar Series offers a stimulating program of free lectures throughout the year in which world-renowned speakers, authors, scholars, political leaders, policy analysts, and theologians, and more share their perspectives on timely issues or their research into history. The program traces its beginnings to the fall of 1954, when Washington Hebrew moved to our current Macomb Street home. That fall, participating in a nationwide celebration marking the 300th anniversary of Jewish settlement in the United States, excuse me, this is the post-high holiday voice, Washington Hebrew launched what would become this now widely recognized Sunday morning lecture program. And we are marking our 70th year this fall, which is very exciting. And I am thrilled to welcome our Amram speaker this morning back to Washington Hebrew Congregation. Some of you might have heard him speak in 2018, I believe it was. Dr. Stephen A. Cook is Eni Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies and Director of the International Affairs Fellowship for Tenured International Relations Scholars at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is an expert on Arab and Turkish politics and U.S. Middle East policy. Stephen has published many award-winning books on the topic: False Dawn, Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East, The Struggle for Egypt, From Nasser to Tahrir Square, which won the 2012 gold medal from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Ruling but Not Governing, The Military and Political Development in Egypt, Algeria, and Turkey. And he is also the author of the recently published Oxford University Press book, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. Stephen is a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine and has published widely in international affairs journals, opinion magazines, and newspapers. He is a frequent commentator on radio and television. Before joining the Council on Foreign Relations, he was a research fellow at the Brookings Institution and a Soref Research Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Stephen holds a BA in International Studies from Vassar College, an MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and an MA and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Pennsylvania. He speaks Arabic and Turkish and reads French. And he is one of the most unassuming, down-to-earth, straight shooters you will meet. Michael and I have been close friends with Stephen and Lauren for close to 15 years. We've spent many days on the soccer field together, selling Girl Scout cookies together, talking about the world and trying to solve the problems of the world in the midst of all of that. And it really is such a pleasure to welcome Stephen to address Dr. Cook. To address this really timely and important issue as we're all trying to figure out where do we go from here. He's going to maybe tell us not exactly where we go from here, but perhaps some insights and suggestions for what we, the United States, might be able to do a little bit better in the future. So, Dr. Stephen Cook.
Thank you, Rabbi Sue. It's nice to be back here. Thank you so much for the very generous opening introduction. It's really nice to be here, all you hardy folks who got out of bed so early this morning. I'm looking at you, Susan Marsh, my fellow Vassar graduate here. It is, by the way, it's also a great thrill to be here. I've enjoyed coming to Washington Hebrew since, I don't know, Lauren, we were dating the first time we came to Washington Hebrew, which was a very, very long time ago. So it's really nice, and this is my probably around the time they opened this room, which is really lovely. It's the first time I've ever been in it. It is truly very, very nice. What I thought I would do this morning is talk a little bit about the book, but also people have a lot on their minds about what's actually happening in the Middle East. It's a happy coincidence that I was late in delivering my book to the publisher And it's a happy, well, it was unhappy at the time. It was happy that my external reviewers made sure that they would torture me as much as possible when it came to the final drafted book. So the book came out, it was actually supposed to come out before October 7th, 2023, and it only went into production a couple of months before then. But it does speak to actually the current moment in the region. So after I talk a bit about the book, and certainly in Q&A, I'm more than happy to talk about what's actually happening and how that is consistent with or runs counter to what I think we actually should be doing, in the Middle East. Let me, just before I start, let me just apologize to those who are live streaming. I don't love podiums. I probably shouldn't run for office ever, and I will never run for office, but I like to move away from podiums. I find them to be too constricting. So if I move away from them, I count on Rabbi Sue and my wife telling me to move back. No, it's okay, it's okay. That's even weirder, because then I want to like sing or something like that. So no, I'm not going to do that. Anyway, like I said, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to be back. This book, people often just launch into what the arguments of the book are, but when I come to something like this, I want to know what the inspiration was. What was the light bulb that went off in the author's head that led to the writing of a book? And it was really two things, maybe three things actually, that led to the end of ambition. The first was, as Sue mentioned, she was very nice to mention my previous books. And my immediately previous book was called False Dawn: Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East. And that was my statement on the Arab uprisings. I won't call them the Arab Spring. Only once in that book do I refer to it as the Arab Spring. And that's sort of why, that sort of gets into why I ended up writing The End of Ambition. I had spent the first 4 days of the uprising in Egypt itself, in Tahrir Square. I had planned on staying longer, but Lauren, who's sitting in the back, told me I had to come home. She said, one, I wasn't getting any younger, and two, I had two small children at home, and if anything happened to me, there would be hell to pay. Of course, if anything happened to me, there would have been no hell to pay because something would have happened to me. That was already it. But anyway, so I came home after 4 days of being in Tahrir Square and observing the uprising against Hosni Mubarak, an extraordinary historical moment, a formative intellectual moment for me. And a number of months later, the Washington Middle East watching community got together at a meeting at the council, not at the Council on Foreign Relations, at the Brookings Institution. And it was a pretty interesting day-long event in which we talked about what was happening in the Middle East. But the undertone, and in fact people have even mentioned this throughout the day, was now that Zine Abidine Ben Ali from Tunisia had fallen, now that Hosni Mubarak had fallen, now that there was an uprising against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, that Bashar al-Assad was in peril in Syria, that there in fact had been uprisings throughout most of the region with the exception of the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, that here was an opportunity to get the Middle East right. And I kept hearing this, and I was like, this is so weird. Why would we say now we, Americans, have an opportunity to get the Middle East right? In those 4 days in Tahrir Square, I talked to many, many Egyptians within the square, on the sidelines in the square, outside of the square, when I left the square, when I went back into the square, since I had been in the square, and no one had mentioned the United States. No one had said, we want the United States' help to make everything great here. But somehow the Washington policy community believed that now is the moment for the United States to get the Middle East. Had I guess not been in Tahrir Square, that would have made sense to me, but it no longer made sense to me having been there and experienced what was going on. And it speaks to something that Fareed Zakaria, who's probably on right now, kudos to you for coming here rather than listening to Fareed, who's a great guy and he's on the board of the Council on Foreign Relations, so I only have nice things to say about him. But he once said something I thought was pretty insightful. The United States is not an imperial power, but Washington is an imperial city. my apologies to those of you who've had long careers in the U.S. government or work in the U.S. government, but that is kind of sort of the way that it works. It's both within the government and within my own community in the outside analytic community, this idea that we now have an opportunity to get things right. And like I said, it didn't make any sense to me having been in Tahrir Square. The second inspiration for the book was a trip I took to Iraq in December 2019. I had been to Iraq before, but this was kind of like a 2-week death march, and I don't really mean death march, but it was like all day, every day through Iraq, except for the southern part of the country. And it was kind of the fullest picture that I had gotten of the devastation of Iraq as a result of the 2003 invasion. Really extraordinary. I had spent most of my time in Kurdistan, in Iraq, because I also work on Turkey. But this was a kind of full picture of everything that had transpired in Iraq since March 2003. And this was December 2019. It really wasn't very pretty at all. There's a line in the book where I would say, Iraq went from, under Saddam, a tyranny, a murderous tyranny, to a violent and chaotic, and that's really what it was. This was even after the time that then President Trump had declared the total defeat of the Islamic State, and yet it was out there, and people were quite concerned about it. I had been to Mosul, where that had been liberated a year or so before. The devastation was absolutely extraordinary. The devastation both from the Islamic State as well as the process of liberating Mosul was absolutely extraordinary. And then the third inspiration for the book was, I'm a firm believer in writing about a place that you've been and studied and know the languages and so on and so forth. It was COVID, and I couldn't go anywhere, so I figured I'd write about the United States. So those are the three inspirations. That was where the end of ambition came from. There was this itch from the third book about getting the Middle East right. Then there was this trip to Iraq that kind of rocked me back on my heels, and it's where I start the book. And then it was obviously COVID. I couldn't leave the house. So I figured I'd write about the United States. I had been wanting to write a book about Iraq 20 years after the invasion, but again, I ended up writing about us. So so that was the inspiration, but what was the question I had? And the question was a simple one. Why do we suck? Why can't we get this right? Like, how do we get why are we so bad at the Middle East? We're pretty successful in Europe, pretty successful in Asia, less successful in Latin America, but Latin America in the 1980s really became something, there was this wave of democratization. Our relationship with Mexico changed dramatically as a result of NAFTA. I know NAFTA is not that popular in the United States. Now it's called like USMECA. But it really fundamentally changed. We were pretty successful in a lot of different places in the world, but we were unsuccessful in the Middle East. What was that about? And as I started digging into this topic, it got even more interesting for me, because there actually was a time when the United States was successful in the Middle East. We were successful. And then there was a moment where we became very, very unsuccessful. Well, what happened there? How did that all happen? And so the argument is the following. Oh, before I get into the actual argument, I tend to stop in the middle of my talks and have a audience interaction moment before Q&A. So your void where prohibited, because you've heard this any number of times, so do not raise your hand. Can anybody tell me what America's core national interests are in the Middle East? Oh, I heard oil. What's next?
Democracy.
No. Related, but no.
Protecting Israel's right to exist.
Helping to ensure Israeli security. And the third, this is related to yours, but I have a different way of putting it. So we have oil, which in the book I call the prime directive for Star Trek fans. 2, we have helping to ensure Israeli security. Anybody else want to? I'm sorry? I'm sorry?
Contain Iran. Suez Canal.
You're all kind of close, but I'll give it to you. You're warm, but not hot. It's American predominance to ensure the other two core interests. From that, you get stability, freedom of navigation, free flow of energy resources out of the region. This was not as well developed until the early 1970s, when the British withdrew from the region east of Suez, or until the October 1973 war. But that had been, at least for the last 50 years, the primary things that the United States wanted to do. And it was wildly successful in doing that. The oil flowed, and there were few threats to Israel's security. We prevented disruptions to the free flow of energy resources, and we helped to prevent threats to Israeli security, and we helped prevent one state or groups of states from challenging American predominance in the region, from which all these other two interests flowed. There were setbacks, of course. October 1973, there was an oil embargo. It didn't last very long. For those of us who were alive at the time, I remember sitting in the back of my father's car because he had an even license plate and waiting for hours for gasoline. But the embargo itself, and so that was probably, the winter of 1974, early 1974, but the embargo itself came to an end in early March 1974. It wasn't very, very long, although the deep recession continued for a long period of time. That was certainly a setback. And even through this oil embargo, the Saudis continued to supply the U.S. military with oil. There were other setbacks. The Iranian Revolution was a setback for the United States because Iran was part of this regional order that helped ensure the free flow of energy resources, helped to prevent threats to Israeli security, and helped prevent threats to American predominance. There are also other kinds of setbacks, relying on authoritarian governments in the region to help us achieve these goals. But overall, we were pretty successful in ensuring that there were no threats to oil, Israel, and our own predominance. Well, then what happened? In the book, I focus on a single year as kind of representative of when things started to flip over. Okay, let's see. Second audience interaction moment. What happened on February 26th, 1991? What about the first Gulf War? It's not just the first Gulf War. What about the first Gulf War? I'm sorry? This is a lovely room, but I'm not sure about the acoustics in here, or I've been listening to music too loud.
Kuwait.
Yes, Kuwait. What about it?
Saddam comes into Kuwait.
Saddam invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. What happened on February 26, 1991? On February 26, 1991, Saddam waves the white flag, and there's essentially an armistice that's established. What happens exactly 10 months later on December 26, 1991? Come on, this, I'm not shaming you all, but this is like a really big deal.
This might be wrong, but did we bomb Libya?
We did not bomb Libya. That was 1986. Okay. December 26, 1991. Boxing Day if you're a Brit or Canadian. Okay. The hammer and sickle came down for the last time over the Kremlin, the end of the Soviet Union. It had been imploding for years before, but it really was the end of the Soviet Union. And those two events, the United States had just demonstrated this awesome, awesome power, deployed more than 500,000 American soldiers to the Gulf to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And then the Soviet Union came to an end. Suddenly, the United States stood alone in the world with a surfeit of power. And the question was, what are we going to do with this power? And we started doing stuff with that power. Even, sober statesmen like George H.W. Bush and Brent Scowcroft. These are, kind of the realest of realists, sober statesmen in the world. Even they started thinking, what are the possibilities for the use of American power in this new era? They called their joint memoir, A World Transformed. A World Transformed. And then, of course, you get deeper into the 1990s and you start having debates in the United States about extending NATO, about economic shock therapy. The whole world was supposed to look like the United States. And so we were going to encourage them to look like us, act like us, throw their security in with us. I remember two things are seared in my brain from that era. One is actually a GE commercial. Amazing. A GE commercial seared in my brain. It showed lights going on all over Eastern and Central Europe. I mean, the metaphor was really hard to miss there. I mean, of course, they were interested in selling light bulbs, but lights were going on all over these scenes. And then at the end, the last set of lights to go on are in Budapest. And this lovely Hungarian woman says, freedom is breaking out everywhere. And so to me, it was sort of metaphorical for this idea that globalization and that the whole world was going to look like us, and we were going to make it happen. I mean, half of my graduating class from Vassar went off to Eastern Europe to like train journalists and do all kinds of stuff like that. And then we had the presidential election in early 1992. You know, Bill Clinton, he was like 46 years old. You know, what was the theme song of the Clinton campaign? Don't stop thinking about tomorrow. Like we were infused with this idea that we could transform the world, that we had won and we had all this power. And what part of the world needed more help than any other? I mean, we don't really think of Africa because it just doesn't register in American foreign policy, although it very much should. And Africa is one of the most interesting places in the world, particularly now. But the part of the world that we believed, collectively believed, needed the most help was the Middle East. And so we went on this binge, this ambitious binge to transform the Middle East. Now, I started out my talk talking about my time in Iraq. Everybody focuses on the invasion of Iraq and the idea that we would transform Iraq as the original sin. Was not. This was a bipartisan effort that began in the mid-1990s. All of the debates about transformation of the Middle East, all of the policies about transforming the Middle East really began in the mid-1990s. And Bill Clinton himself said when talking about the Middle East and embarking on a peace process, there were two things that the Clinton administration was interested in this peace process. One was peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Good thing, good thing. The second one was there was a belief that if there was peace between Israelis and Palestinians, thus there would be peace between Israelis and Arabs writ large, the national security states of the Arab world would fall away and there would be democratic transformations of those countries. That sounds pretty awesome in a conference room with stale coffee and bad DC bagels. Sorry, very provincial, I'm from New York, if you couldn't tell already. That sounds really elegant. You get peace, you get wider peace, and then all these security states with their huge police forces and military forces would fall away because peace and prosperity would be breaking out. It fundamentally misapprehended why there were these big national security states in the Middle East. But nevertheless, that was the policy. And President Clinton said it was his goal to pull the countries of the Middle East into the 21st century. And this was this idea that carried us through the 1990s. In the background of that was a bruising debate about what to do about Iraq. And there was constant pressure on the Clinton administration to do more about Iraq. Iraq was a threat to the world, et cetera, et cetera. President Clinton had really no intention of doing anything, but he did sign the 1998 Iraq Liberation Act, which had broad bipartisan support. I actually believe that Bernie Sanders voted for the Iraq Liberation Act in 1998. I like to remind lots of people of this. And then, of course, September 11th happened. And after September 11th, people say, oh, September 11th, everything changed. No, September 11th was an enabling moment for lots of the ideas that were incubated during this moment of triumph in the 1990s. And so the predicate for the invasion of Iraq, the legal predicate in the Congress for the invasion of Iraq was essentially the Iraq Liberation Act. And the idea was if Clinton was going to get freedom and democracy through peace, post 9/11, Bush was going to get peace through political reform and change. I remember those days after 9/11. I was at the Brookings Institution, and there was this mad rush to try to figure out, both within the kind of outside analytic community as well as within the government, to figure out, well, what do we do? What do we do? How do we remember this? How do we drain the swamp of terrorists? And so I think people went on their bookshelves, and they were like, And they pieced together this idea that democracy is an antidote for terrorism. There is this argument that democracies don't fight each other, which has been contested by IR theorists for 25, 30 years, since the time I was in graduate school. But there was also this idea that came through that the way to drain the swamp was to promote democracy in the Middle East. And so the Bush administration launched simultaneously an effort to remake Iraq and remake the societies of the Middle East through what was called the Freedom Agenda. I mean, is it an accident that it was called Operation Iraqi Freedom? Now, some of my friends and critics will say, no. Actually, the Iraq thing was really about security. They genuinely believed that Iraq had nuclear weapons, that Iraq had chemical weapons, and it was genuinely a threat to the region and global security. That may, in fact, be true. In fact, that was true. But when Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said, well, we're just going to put another Iraqi general in the seat, and that'll be fine, the President of the United States said, no, we're not going to all this trouble to saddle the Iraqi people with yet another dictator. We're going to make Iraq a democracy. We're going to make the Palestinian Authority more democratic, because a more democratic Palestinian Authority will make peace with Israel. Remember what happened in the 2006 Palestinian elections? Okay. The idea was that we would promote this awesome change in the region. We would shepherd this change in the region through both the use of force as well as this kind of multifaceted approach to promoting democracy and change in the region. Of course, if you look at the record of both the Clinton and Bush administrations, the return on investment, sometimes I say it's zero, but it's less than zero, actually. There were setbacks. If you look at the records of both, at the end of both of those presidents' terms, Iraq was clearly further from democracy in just a different way as it was under Saddam Hussein. No Arab country became a democracy for our efforts. Tunisia, the one quote unquote, and this is the only time I say it, the one Arab Spring success story, had nothing to do with anything that the United States did in the Middle East. And now Tunisia in October 2024 is exactly where it was, maybe worse than it was in December 2010 when the Tunisian uprising began, because of a coup there in the summer of 2021. But it's not also about President Clinton and President Bush. President Obama was seized with this idea of transformation, but in somewhat different ways. He did go to Cairo in June of 2009 and give a speech and said, you know what, this whole freedom agenda thing that my predecessor did, I'm not really that interested in it. But if you all become democracies, you can count on us to help. And that's essentially what happened after the Arab uprisings. But what was extraordinary about it wasn't just, hey, we're going to give you help, is that Obama, someone who worked for him who I know, someone pretty senior who I know who worked for him, referred to him as a realist who felt bad about it. He sort of got the democracy bug himself, despite saying, hey, this freedom agenda, this was not a good use of our resources. It only created tension between the United States and this part of the world, et cetera, et cetera. When after Hosni Mubarak fell, after Ben Ali fell, he went to the State Department in May 2011, and he gave a speech. And no one demanded this speech other than the Washington policy community. And he went to this, and he gave a speech that George W. Bush could have made about, we don't have to settle for the world as it is. Here's a moment where we can remake the world the way it ought to be. So it's like, whoa, what's going on? And connecting what was happening in the Arab world to the struggle for civil rights in this country. It was this extraordinarily transformative, ambitious address. But it went even beyond that in a somewhat different way. What was President Obama's signature initiative in the Middle East? It wasn't peace, it wasn't democracy, it was the Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was an arms control agreement, but there was also something transformative inherent about in the thinking in the agreement, which was that the agreement would force the countries of the region to share the region, that it would foster a different regional order than one that had existed, that would allow the United States to withdraw from the region. The United States retrench from the region, to become, quote unquote, an offshore balancer in the region. We had tried offshore balancing in the 1970s. It didn't work. We had to go back, and then we stayed. But so my point is that this transformative impulse, this overly ambitious impulse to remake the region in a variety of different ways is shared by the American foreign policy community. This isn't a Democratic problem. This isn't a Republican problem. This isn't a this is a problem of the American foreign policy community in believing that the United States has the power to do this. So here, the argument of the book comes into full kind of expression. Prior to 1991, arguably 1991, I just like that date a lot. It seems like a good, people can argue with me when things really changed. The United States sought to prevent bad things from happening, prevent disruptions to the free flow of energy resources, prevent threats to Israeli security, prevent one country or a combination of countries from threatening American predominance, from which we protected those two other core interests. Post-1991, as we got deeper into the 90s and certainly throughout the 2000s, we sought to leverage American power to make good things happen, to make democracy in the region, to make peace in the region, to do all kinds of things without a recognition of the limits of American power to do these kinds of things. This is an extraordinarily American thing to want to do. After all, we saved the world from Nazism, we saved the world from communism. Freedom was breaking out all over. Why should the Middle East be different? Why should the Middle East be different? But it needed American help. And of course, the return on investment was next to zero. So the question is, now what? What do we do? I tried to write this book and not say now what, because that's always the hardest part to do. You know, one of the conceits of people like me who work in think tanks is that somehow we have better ideas than the very, very smart people who work in government. And that's not always the case. But it is the case that people who work in government are often responding to events rather than thinking forward about what we should do. And I lay out in detail in the last chapter of the book, which I had originally called Goldilocks, Searching for Goldilocks in the Middle East. But someone who's written 20 books said it was a bad title of a chapter, so I changed it. But the argument is in the chapter, not too much United States, not too little United States, but just enough United States. To focus on what, and I'm not going to tell you, because I have a child in college. And I have another child who has a very expensive hobby. She rides horses. So I own half a horse. I lease half a horse. Don't ask me which half. So I'm not going to tell you in detail, you know, it's on Amazon, it's here, you can get it, whatever. But I'll tell you what the argument is. Not too much United States, not too little United States, the right amount of United States. What we lost in this 30 years of overly ambitious effort to transform the region is what is important to the United States in the region. What is worth defending, what's worth sacrificing for, what's worth investing in. In the period between, you know, really post 9/11 up until arguably 2015 or so, or maybe 2008, everything and anything was a core American interest. Everything was crucially important. And policymakers were unable to distinguish what might be nice to have versus what was truly important to the United States. And my pleading to my colleagues, both in the broader analytic community as well as to government officials, is let's understand the world as it is, not the way we want to make it, and what's important to the United States in the Middle East, in the world in which we live, in the reality in which we currently live, rather than trying to change that reality. Because when we try to change that reality, we do things that are not good for us or that part of the world. The unintended consequences are uncontrollable. And we don't actually have the insight, knowledge, or resources to change other people's societies so far away from the United States. One of the assumptions that American policymakers often carry into the region is that we actually have the power to drive these events within these countries, and we actually do not. So my pleading is, please, what is it that's truly important to the United States? And I list out 7 things that are important to the United States in the last chapter of this book. And what I say is that actually, in a weirdly, and I love this when this happens, and it only dawned on me, you see a book and you're like, oh, comes together. Like, these things come together in this kind of weird, haphazard way, and like you build an intellectual scaffolding, and like it doesn't work, and you build something else. But it was really only towards the end that I realized, paradoxically, when we try to prevent bad things from happening, we tend to be actually more constructive in the region than when we try to leverage our power to make good things happen. And people should remember that. Now, let me spend a minute or two talking about current events and how this book relates to current events. As I said before, the book went into production a couple months actually before October 7th. It went into production, I know, because it was such a struggle, on July 15th, 2003. And one of the challenges of writing books, the kinds of books that I write, is something can happen. I remember I was finalizing False Dawn, which is the book before this, which is not just about the Arab world, but it's also about Turkey. There was an uprising in Turkey that people forget about. And I was reading through galleys of that book, and there was a coup attempt in Turkey. And I found myself in the weird position of rooting for the bad guys in the coup rather than rooting for the good guys, because I didn't want to have to rewrite everything. And I was kind of lucky. Or I finished The Struggle for Egypt from Nasser Tahrir Square on January 20th, 2011, handed it to my publisher, and then went to Egypt and found myself in the middle of the Egyptian uprising 5 days later, which I got back to Washington, and my editor emailed me. He's like, we should talk. I said, have you read the manuscript? He said, no. I said, read it and call me back. The whole point of that book was that Egypt was not as stable as people made it out to be. So he's like, oh, great, we just have to change some verb tenses. I was like, yeah, it saved me. This book also, I was lucky. What President Biden did, and then the reaction to what President Biden did, were all presaged in the book. I basically had to add 12 pages of like what happened on October 7th, but I didn't have to rewrite it. President Biden did what I said that any president would do, which was help to ensure Israeli security. But there's a whole part of the book in this last chapter, which was called Searching for Goldilocks in the Middle East, which I think it still should be. That's why I keep mentioning it, but whatever, where I talk about the changing politics of the U.S.-Israel relationship in this country. And we're talking about the changing way people are looking at this relationship, and actually offer some ideas for how to manage these very important political changes that are underway. There's been calls to punish Israel for its conduct in the Gaza Strip or its conduct in Lebanon, although significantly less when it comes to Lebanon, because the Israelis are essentially fighting Iran there. And what I say is it's actually better for these two countries to fundamentally alter the way in which we do business with each other, which will reduce the emotionalism around the relationship. Maybe folks at the Appropriations Committee might want to read it and learn from it and so on and so forth. I don't know. In any event, the ideas in the book are consistent with what has happened in the region, which is that we should drop the idea that Iran wants a new relationship with the United States. There's no evidence of it. That Iran basically wants to push the United States out of the Middle East. It also remains a core interest of Iran to destroy Israel. And that's why we're having this this problem. And we're having this problem because we've been unwilling to actually contain and deter the Iranians. And that is also a bipartisan problem in our foreign policy community. We have given, administration after administration after administration, have given the Iranians permission to sow chaos around the region. And this constant patter about de-escalation is not just something that is of the Biden administration or the Obama administration. The most egregious, actually, violation of the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan corollary of the Carter Doctrine, which commits the United States to the defense of the oil fields of the Persian Gulf and the stability of the region, was President Trump. During the summer of 2019, the Iranians took oil tankers hostage, mined the Persian Gulf, shot down an American surveillance drone operating in international airspace over the Gulf, and then attacked Saudi Arabia. Attacked Saudi Arabia with drones, attacked two major oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, temporarily taking 50% of Saudi supply off the market. And the response from President Trump was, they attacked Saudi Arabia, they didn't attack us. And it was the one moment I remember, maybe there were more, the one moment I remember of bipartisan support for President Trump's policy, because the Democrats were concerned about Saudi Arabia's human rights record and the murder of the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi a year before. And the idea was, well, we're not going to defend Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Now, a few of us at the time wrote, there's a consequence to doing nothing here, to throwing out the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan corollary. And we're now living in that world. We're now living in that world of doing nothing to respond to the very, very, very aggressive provocations on the part of the Iranians throughout that era. Okay, I'll stop there. I think I'm good on time. Sue, Rabbi Sue's going to come back, and she's going to manage Q&A. We're going to sit down too, right? Awesome. We're going to hang out. All right, great. Well, thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
First, I laughed. I said to Lauren and Michael, you talk about writing the book and then hoping that nothing happens. It's sort of like rabbis preparing for a high holiday sermon, and of course something always happens. So you're always being prepared. And
I'll tell you all a secret about Rabbi Sue. I was in Israel in mid-September, and you texted me, and I was like, hey, I'm in Israel. And I was there for the week of the beeper attack, the walkie-talkie attack, and when they killed the top commanders of Hezbollah. But I
was working on my sermon I had two sermons for the high holidays, as most of you probably know. I actually ended up switching and deciding to speak about Israel on Rosh Hashanah before lots of additional things, before
right, but
Iran.
I said to Sue, I was like, wow, you have the hardest job in the world to write a sermon during what was going on.
And asking you about what was going on the ground there at the same time. So one of the things that's really fascinating about your book is that you explore and examine, and you referred to some of these U.S. policy and strategy over decades, since even before the creation of the State of Israel. But looking at, and a big part of what you talked about is, the U.S. strategy and policy. One of the pillars of that is defense of Israel and supporting Israel. But even before Israel existed, there certainly have been those sort of policies towards the Middle East. Which one do you think came closest to getting it right?
Which administration?
Which administration?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So what Sue's referring to is there's an arc of American policy towards Israel. President Truman recognized the provisional government of the State of Israel, and then basically didn't care about Israel. And Eisenhower was somewhat hostile to the State of Israel. It really wasn't until the Kennedy administration where the modern U.S.-Israel relationship really began. He was the first president to use the term special relationship. He, of course, was the first one in the major arms sales, the Hawk missiles, which, by the way, the Israelis still have in storage. And we had asked them to give them to the Ukrainians, and the Israelis refused to do that. This was early on in the Ukraine crisis when they were still currying favor with the Russians. In any event, I mean, it's hard to grade administrations. There's administrations you can look at that sort of got the Middle East writ large right.
Would there be any combination that you would say
Well,
of these policies?
I'd say that probably the George H.W. Bush administration, which is weird because people remember George H.W. Bush as being somewhat not as friendly to Israel as perhaps his successor, Bill Clinton, and so on and so forth. And I remember, anytime the issue of settlements would come up, George H.W. Bush would get this vein in his neck would start to come out. There were bruising battles in that administration over loan guarantees to the Israelis. The Israelis wanted loan guarantees to help resettle Russian emigres. I mean, this was the time there's a huge aliyah of Russians, and the George W. Bush administration said, you can get loan guarantees, but you can't use the money that you raise more favorably on commercial markets to develop settlements in the West Bank. But I think, by and large, and this is, bless you, I think this is also an issue with the Biden administration. There is, people kind of focus on rhetoric and what people say, and a little bit less on what they do. And so I think George H.W. Bush ordered the U.S. military to defend Israel during the Gulf War. I mean, there were American forces, there were American Patriot missile batteries sent to Israel to do it. Israel did not have the multi-layered air defense system that it has now. He pushed the peace process. It was the price that the Saudis wanted to push the peace. But overall, I think pretty good. I think the Clinton administration got too deeply wrapped around the peace process. And in fact, one of the famous peace processors, Aaron Miller, has said we acted too much like Israel's lawyer.
By the way, that's not Rabbi Aaron Miller. That's the other.
Aaron David Miller.
Well, he's also Aaron David Miller, but not Rabbi Aaron David Miller, but the other Aaron David Miller.
I guess when you're dealing with Jews, Aaron David Miller, that's kind of pretty. You're going to get a few of those, I guess.
He's used to it.
Right, and then George W. Bush, didn't really distinguish themselves so much on the Israel front. I mean, they made a huge mistake by pushing Palestinian elections.
Well, and how much of, and then we'll go to audience questions, but how much of U.S. policy has been impacted by what you allude to or argue is potentially whether we say cultural naivete, paternalistic, sort of Western values put on to another culture, and certainly when you look at—
I didn't even allude to it. I mean, I lay it out. I mean, American policymakers have gone to the Middle East with 5 assumptions about America and the Middle East that have proven over and over again to be incorrect. Things like culture doesn't matter, or the flip side of it, that culture determines everything. That you can have democracy without Democrats. That you can have— I'm sorry? You can have that you can actually have democracy without Democrats, or that you— I mean, that was when I was in grad school. That was a big part of political scientists who were interested in the Middle East. That was a big part of the research program, which the research program was about the stability of authoritarianism, but how democracy might happen in the Middle East. And the idea was that you didn't have to have Democrats to be— But of course, subsequent events demonstrate that you actually kind of do need to have people who believe in these ideas. I mean, if you read all the constitutions in these parts of the world, you're like, if you were a Martian and you came down from Mars and you said, let me read the Egyptian constitution, you'd be like, this is a great place. I want to live here. So that, so this idea that we could have democracy without Democrats, there's a number of others I won't go into details about. There's assumptions about the peace process that American policymakers had taken to the region, which is more a reflection of our own thinking than the actual realities on the ground. And my plea is that we're never going to, presidents, secretaries of state, national security advisors, they're not going to, understand the region like those of us who've marinated ourselves in it. And that's why I say, hey, let's just focus on what's important, what's actually important to us in the region, and we'll probably end up in a much better place than where we are now.
Thank you. All right, I do see a couple of hands.
Double duty for the rabbi. She's going to hand out the microphone as well as— Nice.
Go ahead, it's on.
I listened very closely, and I never heard the word economics mentioned. About a year ago, I attended a conference at Brookings, which talked about the Middle East in most countries in very bad economic shape. The theme of the conference was about the relationship between Islam and economic development. But I came away with thinking maybe the right policy is the equivalent of the Marshall Plan in the Middle East. Instead of focusing on policy or military, why don't we worry about improving economic situations? Maybe that would make a difference.
Well, speaking of fantasies, a Marshall Plan for the Middle East is something that came up endlessly in the post 9/11 policy discussions. And it was as unrealistic then as it is now. And look, my own view is, first of all, I didn't mention economics because I'm a political scientist, a historically minded political scientist rather than a political scientist who wants to be an economist, which seems to be a lot of political scientists these days. But I think the United States has spent a lot of time and effort to preach, support, and avoid the collapse of economies in the Middle East. But what we did over many years is the economic support that, for example, we provided to Egypt was really not about building an inclusive market economy with the actual institutions of a market economy. It was about generating enough economic development so that people would have a stake in the regime and stability, because the authoritarian leaders of that country were part of a regional political order that made it easier and relatively less expensive for the United States to pursue those three interests that I outlined early on in my talk. And now, basically, it's the kinds of things that we do, we mostly do through the IMF, and we go through this dance in which they say we're doing it, we say you're not, and then they get the money anyway, particularly in the case of Egypt, which is too big to fail. But then you have countries in the Gulf, which are developing at an extraordinarily rapid rate, attracting huge amounts of foreign investment, have the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world. I think and who essentially keep these other economies afloat. I'm not quite sure what the United States has to offer when it comes to these economies that are going to be either transformative or anything else, other than working through the IMF to support those countries that are in dire straits and counseling them to do a better job. But there's always a discussion of what to do about the economy, and it's never a focal point of our policy because there's not that much we can do about it.
Well, why is it a fantasy? I don't understand it.
Well, I think that first, politically, the stars do not align for a massive investment in the reconstruction of the Middle East. I mean, we can't even agree on the Purple Line, and it takes 40 years to build it. We can't do it. And the value proposition of a Marshall Plan to both parties, a Marshall Plan for the Middle East to both parties, which Democrats have talked endlessly about de-emphasizing the Middle East, and Republicans, there's a strong strain of America first there. Why can't the hugely wealthy Saudis, Emiratis, and Qataris rebuild the economies in the Middle East? Why would it have to be? I'm just channeling what the argument is likely to be.
Thank you, Rabbi. Wonderful talk. It's really a two-part question having to do with the red line, the famous red line.
Which there's been many red lines.
Oh, this is the
There was the Rafah red line, there was the Syria red line.
This is the Syria red line. Mm-hmm. There are two parts to this question because some people believe that triggered the Crimea invasion by Russia. But there's a second part of the question having to do with the cacophony within policy. Which I was sort of part of when I worked in the government. I was in part of the National Security Council apparatus. And I found that it was like 4 Jews and 5 synagogues. People don't agree on most anything when they have to go, when push comes to shove. And that the CIA actually is outsourced to their clients. They work for clients. They don't work as a composite organization. So my question is, going back to the red line, does that show a lack of understanding of what implication that happened, and also the lack of unanimity within the apparatus of the executive branch to implement that policy?
Yeah, let me start with the second, your point about the interagency process, which is like 4 Jews and 5 synagogues. That's very, very funny. I once sat down. Wait.
Yes, I just wanted to say that, but the rabbi's children were educated by my wife, so I just, it's a little.
I once sat down with a number of colleagues and friends who had served in kind of senior positions in government. I said, well, why don't we do this, 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 and this? And they kind of looked at me and they said, Stephen, it's so hilarious. You never sat in on one of these interagency meetings where nobody can agree on anything. And that's sort of the way can you say sausage in synagogue? The way the sausage is made. It's very, very uncomfortable, and it doesn't necessarily get to the place where each agency wants to get, but you get eventually somewhere. I mean, that was the whole thing with the Iraq War, right? Everybody could agree, at least at the bottom level, that Iraq was a threat to regional security. So that was the public justification for it. But we know from Condoleezza Rice's memoir, that the president said, no, we got to go all the way. We got to do democracy in Iraq because it'll transform the region. On this question of red lines, by the way, let me just expand it out beyond Syria. When it comes to actually our partners in the region, there really are no red lines. We may announce that there's a red line, like we had a red line on Rafah. There was no consequences for the Israelis to go into Rafah after we announced that they shouldn't go into Rafah. Whether that was right or not to have a red line on it is a separate conversation. You know, Egyptians have the worst human rights record in the region, among the worst human rights records in the world. There's no red line. They continue to get their full boat of military assistance. The Saudis can, march into someone else's civil war and help create a humanitarian disaster. There's no red line. There's no red line for them. When it came to Obama's red line on Syria, it strikes me that he was basically focused on the fact that he had long said, don't do stupid stuff, but we all know he was using another S word. And from his perspective, doing stupid stuff was marching into another conflict in the Middle East without a way out. It strikes me that you probably should have thought through that before you declared that there was a red line, right? The problem was not necessarily the policy, although people can argue the policy. The policy was a bad one. The problem was declaring there was a red line, believing you would never have to make good on it. And it did. It is one of those things that not only helps give the Iranians and others the permission to do things, it also encourages our partners to hedge with Russians and Chinese and so on and so forth. Because there's an understanding that we're allowing other countries to do stuff to their detriment. What are they going to do about it? They're going to hedge with other great powers, and that's a consequence. I was in Riyadh I'm going in a couple weeks, but I was there in April, late April, early May, and these guys can give you a list of things that we have done since 2000 that, from their perspective, leaves them at the mercy of the Iranians. Now, some of this is kind of cynical, but some of it you're like, yeah, no, I can't argue with that. I can't argue with that one either. That was pretty bad. We shouldn't have done that.
This may be a naive question.
No question is naive or bad or anything.
But when you were talking about democracies and that the U.S., has this hope that we could create a democracy, I was thinking of 3 nations, and I want to know, are they democracies? I think of Jordan, it's got a king, UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. What are those? How do you put them into the picture?
So, Jordan is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. It has a parliament. There were recently elections in that parliament. The king wasn't necessarily so happy with the outcome of that election. What his father used to do when he wasn't happy with an outcome of the election, he would rewrite the electoral law in a way that would, the next time around, would make it easier for them. There'll be something like that. There is a president in the UAE. The crown prince became the president, but it is a federated state of 7 basically city-states, and it's a monarchy of sorts. They don't call themselves a monarchy, but this is not a democratic country. They like to think of themselves as a sort of benign authoritarian system, and the Emiratis often will show you polls showing that Emiratis are among the happiest people in the world, and so on. So, and, if you go to Dubai and you go to Abu Dhabi, it's very impressive. But when you have loads and loads of money, you can build very impressive infrastructure and so on and so forth. But they hardly have good human rights records. They also have a parliament. They've done some interesting things. They've been very aggressive about pushing women into ministerial roles. There's the Abrahamic interfaith house that they built, which is super interesting. It's kind of, the synagogue is sort of a postmodern synagogue, and the church and the they're all kind of postmodern. It's kind of cool. A lot of emphasis on tolerance there, but by no means a democracy. And Qatar, the Emir, this is a ruling family. And also they've tried to project an image of modernity and so on and so forth without doing much in the way of political change. Long time ago, early in my career, I was in Doha, and I asked my hosts, hey, I want to meet the opposition. And they kind of looked at me and they were like, opposition? And so if you define politics as the competition over the control of resources, it was very, so they finally produced this guy. And he said to me, I'm happy, but I can be happier. And so, it's a kind of a country without much in the way of politics, to be completely honest with you. But these are our partners in the region, and then none of them are above having bad human rights records. I mean, go to the State Department website and call up the annual human rights reports on all of our regional partners, and it is breathtakingly bad. I was reading Turkey's just the other day. I could not. It was like, this is a NATO ally. Oh my God, this is terrible. And all of them are absolutely terrible. No red lines.
During your talk, you reiterated that a core mission of Iran is to destroy Israel. Why is this? And if it is religiously based, how concerning should this be, given that 1 out of every 4 people on this planet is Muslim?
Yeah, it's a good question with regard to Iran and the broader Muslim world. Let me just say that you have to differentiate between the Iranian regime and the Iranian people. What we know about the Iranian people is that they're really dislike the regime, and it seems clear that the Iranian regime came to power in 1979 on a number of pillars. And one of those pillars is hostility to the West, and in particular the United States, and that Israel is seen as uniquely Western colonial implant in the region, and then must be destroyed. It is both a mechanism of mobilization for the revolution, as well as an ideologically held truth among supporters of the regime and the regime itself, that Israel should be wiped away. I can't speak for the billions of Muslims around the world. There's certainly a lot of hostility towards Israel within the Muslim world, as well as there's a fair amount of acceptance. I talk a bit about this in terms of the region, that although the support for normalization of relations between Israel and other countries in the region is fairly low, I mean, in the single digits. Although, you can make a poll to say anything, basically. It's like, an accountant. Well, what number do you want it to be? The fact of the matter is that there was a grudging acceptance of Israel, not necessarily its legitimacy, but its reality in the region. I'm not willing to make an argument about, Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, because I don't know it. I'm not willing to make an argument about Malaysia, although there have been lots of pro-Hamas protests in Malaysia, but there's also been a lot of pro-Hamas protests at university campuses in the United States. So I do think, though, that when it comes to Iran specifically, the American foreign policy community, both outside and inside the government, have been seized with the idea that the Iranians want a new relationship with the United States. based on very, very little evidence. It's one of these assumptions that we made. That because the Iranian people wanted that engagement and that somehow this will change the regime. The regime clearly knows this. So we should drop the idea that the Iranians want a new relationship with the United States until there's evidence that they do, and act accordingly. That's something that's important to us. And because the Iranians are a threat to free flow of energy resources, freedom of navigation, Israel's security, and a whole range of other issues. How are we doing on time?
We're good. They have
Okay, good.
a couple of questions.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more with regard to what appears to be the generational shifts in attitudes towards Israel in the United States that I think are going to, in my own view, is that they're probably going to continue in the direction that we all kind of woke up and realized that they've been there for a little while. And how is that going to change the kind of strategic posture of the United States? If one of the main goals was to have the protection of Israel, how will that change the relationship? And correspondingly, does Israel have some kind of reaction to that in their own way that we should be thinking about that might change as well?
Right. It's a great question. And let me tell you, as someone who spent a lot of time on university campuses, I finished my PhD, holy crap, 21 years ago, but have remained connected to universities in a variety of ways. There's nothing that happened on university campuses over the last year that surprised me at all. I know my colleagues in the social sciences and the humanities. I know them too well. I knew what was going on throughout. I knew what they were teaching and how they were teaching these things. And so there's nothing that surprised me. I think people who were disconnected from universities didn't understand how radicalized faculty had become, particularly on this issue, were surprised by it, but there's nothing that surprises me about it. And there's been a lot of focus on students. What I have said when I get this kind of question is that it's really been a faculty that has fostered and enabled an environment and a generation of young people who are credentialed but not educated on this issue. Early on in the conflict, probably was like a week old, we were having a program at the Council on Foreign Relations, and they added me to it. There was a big meeting with the University of Texas's the superintendent. What do they call it? The big honcho, the guy who runs the entire University of Texas system. His advisory board was at CFR for a meeting, and they added me to the program to talk about what was going on. And one of them asked me, what keeps you up at night? And I said, besides what I think is coming in the Middle East, what keeps me up at night is that some student who's going to arrive on your campus in next August, wanting to learn about the Arab-Israeli conflict, is not going to be able to learn about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, in the book, I talk about this. I pull out the polls. I show how there was this huge divide even before the conflict. Pew did a poll in the spring of 2023, which showed that more Democrats were, and it wasn't even broken down by age, but that more Democrats were sympathetic to the Palestinian cause than they were to Israel. So this was a trend that was going in a certain direction. Some of it has to do with the nature, the profile of the Israeli government, but nevertheless, this is a trend line. And what I suggest in the book is, instead of having these 10-year memorandums of understanding in which we're obligated to fund Israel, give essentially Israel budget relief to the tune of $3.5 to $5 billion a year in military assistance, and in a country with the GDP per capita is $52,000 a year, it clearly a Western industrialized country, that we should get ahead of these changes that are going ahead and enshrine our relationship in a security pact and treaties and pacts over security, technology, and so on and so on. Israel and the United States clearly benefit from the relationship that we have with each other, but I think the way in which the relationship is configured right now adds to a crazy kind of emotionalism around the relationship and what I call for is a normalization of the relationship, and that it would put the relationship on a more stable footing. It won't be subject to wild, crazy emotions and rhetoric, encouraging rabbis across the political spectrum to write to the soon-to-be senior senator from Maryland about his use of his language on Israel, and that then he can kind of blow it off. I mean, outrageous kind of stuff. The Israelis are also reacting emotionally. Anti-Semitism, but they're actually doing something very, very interesting, which is entirely predictable. There was a little piece in the Israeli business news the other day that the Israeli defense contractor Elbit is establishing a factory to do what? Build 2,000-pound bombs and artillery shells, so that they don't have to come running to you, and they don't have to use whatever expletive you want to use with motivated members of Congress who want to punish them in what they see as a war for their own survival. That's what's going to happen. They're ruining the day that they canceled the Lavi fighter program.
I think it's clear that Iran is a pretty malevolent actor in the Middle East. It supports failed states in Syria and Lebanon. It interferes in other countries. And a lot of the Sunni Arab states don't like Iran. And obviously it supports actors that want to destroy the state of Israel. And it's also kind of clear, though, that they're happy to allow thousands of Palestinians to die in defense of their strategic objectives, and now Lebanese as well. But it seems like they don't really want Iranians to be dying in defense of this. And, as you said before, there's a distinction between the Iranian people who have tried to, in the past decade or so, have uprisen against their government numerous times to be squelched violently. What do you think, if anything, the U.S. should do about Iran? Because it seems like maybe they're not quite as powerful,
Right.
because they're not willing to take on Israel directly. And maybe it's because they fear that if there is a really major war, that their own people are not going to support this regime, which is hand and fist
Right.
with the Iranian National Guard, which they, the mullahs support them economically. They're mutually supportive of each other, and it's hard to break that authoritarian grasp.
Right. So there's, that is exactly the case. The Iranians want to fight to the last Palestinian and the last Lebanese, just like the Saudis want to fight to the last American. It seems like the only people who are willing to sacrifice for themselves are Israelis and Americans, which isn't entirely true. We do have some good partners in the region. But yes, that is in fact the case. The regime is manifestly unpopular. A wise Saudi said to me, Iran, they're like a paper tiger with iron claws. And the iron claws are Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias and so on and so forth. But that if you attacked Iran directly, you would recognize how weak it is. That's a nice thing to hear. But of course, the Iranians also have the largest ballistic missile force in the entire region, and just a month ago fired 181 ballistic missiles at Israel. So they're not that weak, but they clearly don't want to have as much skin in the game as they say, because my friends who are the real Iran experts would say that they can't risk it because the axis of resistance, Hezbollah, Hamas, not very popular among the Iranian people. Why are the Iranians spending huge amounts of money on foreign policy adventures that most Iranians don't actually really support? They'd be very happy to have good relations with the United States and, in fact, Israel. So what should we do about it? I get very nervous when people say that we have something to do about it. I think, look, the Iranian regime's life expectancy can be 3 weeks or 30 years. We don't really know. Did anybody think that Hosni Mubarak would be overthrown in February 2011? No, Egyptian leaders die in office and then they build pyramids to their everlasting memory. So we really don't know. What I would say, though, is that we have to have a much more robust policy with regard to Iran's malign activities around the region, right? So why is it that the Iranian ship in the Red Sea that was helping to direct Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, giving the Houthis leverage over the Red Sea and over the international economy, why did that remain afloat? Right? I mean, there's things that we can do. What I call for in the book is deterrence and containment. And that sounds namby-pamby-ish, but it neither precludes military action nor dialogue with the Iranians. It's almost the best of both worlds. Let's take regime change off the table for the United States. Let's leave that to the Iranian people, but let's also make sure that the Iranians understand actual red lines. Actual red lines. And that summer of 2019 and a variety of other things, they understood that there were no red lines and that they can continue to do the kinds of things that they had been doing in the region. And as I said before, that's now the world in which we live.
So last question from the audience.
What do you think is the root cause of the Iranian-Israeli conflict? And do you think there's anything Israel could do to make a peace with Iran?
The root cause of the Iranian-Israel is the ideological worldview of the Iranian leadership, which is that Israel is an illegitimate Western colonial implant in the region, and that Zionism needs to be snuffed out. And the way to do that is to push the United States out of the region, and Israel goes with it. That's it. There's no peace agreement with the Iranian regime, the current Iranian regime. There's no peace. That was an easy last question.
Although I thought you were going to go a little longer to get me around that. I don't like to walk in front of people.
Oh, you could have. Well, anyway.
So my last question was going to be about your final chapter, which I didn't realize that you hadn't told me that it was about Goldilocks. But I love the title, the actual title, which for any of us who were in high school and college in the 80s, it's Back to the Future. And really I know you can't predict the future, but where do we go from here, especially when we see things like Friday's Israel going towards Iran, and who knows what else. I mean, there's such instability in the midst of the war that's ongoing right now, and a lot of questions about what happens next.
Right. Well, with regards to Israel, at a strategic level, Israel is in a better position than it was on October 6th, 2023. I know people are like, what? How is that possible? Well, Hamas has been severely disabled. It still has fight left in it, but there's no Hamas leadership, essentially. And there is the problem of fighting kind of atomized armed cadres, but that's different from a real significant existential threat to the state, as we saw on October 7th. Hezbollah has been greatly weakened. Decapitation doesn't mean the end, but the Israelis have prepared for 20 years for this fight and have done a tremendous amount of damage. There's still a long, long way to go. And then Iran, on Friday night, the Israelis left the Iranians completely defenseless. The Iranians don't have an air defense system. So if the Iranians respond, the Israelis have the opportunity to do whatever it is that they want. All that being said, there remains these problems. These fights continue. The Palestinian issue is not going to go away. It is not going to go away. It commands our attention. The unfortunate part of the Palestinian issue is that there's no resolution to it. There is American Jews, let me tell you, there's no two-state solution. There's no resolution to this problem. Right now, we have a fight between one-staters on both sides. But even if you didn't, the Israelis can't satisfy the Palestinians' minimum demands for peace. The Palestinians can't satisfy the Israeli minimum demands for peace. And the United States, for 30 years, tried to change that reality and was unable to do it. So while strategically Israel is in a far superior position than it was on October 6th,
especially now that we, what people were long saying, that Iran was behind this under, as Debbie was asking, under the surface or masked. The mask is off.
Right,
Everybody knows exactly who's behind much of this.
Right. And so, but still, there is going to be instability and conflict for the foreseeable future. Now, as far as the United States goes, it strikes me that despite our deeply polarized politics, no matter how things go on November 5th, my point is, there's not as much difference between the two candidates on the Middle East as one would think, based on the huge differences between the two of them. So, which would suggest to me that we're not prepared to do the kinds of things that need to be done in terms of Iran. That we're not going to get serious about the fact that there's not a resolution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians and think creatively about what to do about it. So I'm hoping whoever wins that they read The End of Ambition and maybe get a little bit of wisdom from it. And so we'll see. I have more hopes for one side or the other, but I won't tell you which one.
We can send a copy to both, and then maybe.
It's already been done.
And then we have to think about, and this opens a whole other can of worms, the next Israeli election is scheduled for October of 2026. If it goes until then,
I'm convinced it will. The stunning irony is that the government that presided over October 7th is going to be the one Israeli government in, 20 years that serves out its full term.
We'll see.
Craziness
We'll
in
see.
Middle
Back
East
to the
every day.
future.
Yeah, back to the future.
Thank you.
No, thank you all. It's been really great. Terrific questions. Thanks for your attention.
And we invite you if you would like to purchase the book, an early Hanukkah gift, and Stephen will be available to sign those out in the atrium.